Good afternoon. This year's defence budget caused considerable alarm in a lot of quarters. One commentator said, cuts to the defence budget announced last week will cripple Australia's capacity to cope with a serious security crisis over the next quarter of a century. He went on to observe, the government has not only removed funds from priority defence acquisitions, but it has seriously damaged the trust of senior defence personnel. Building on this theme, another commentator went as far as to say, the government is, in an underhanded and duplicitous way, shredding the previously announced 2009 defence plan. Given the raw facts in the budget, such assessments are perhaps not surprising. $2.4 billion of planned investment in equipment and facilities was deferred to beyond 2014, and $3.9 billion of mostly recurrent funding promised for the next decade was taken back by the government. On the surface, it might reasonably be concluded that the government has shortchanged defence to ensure that it can deliver a surplus in 2013, what is after all the political holy grail in the current environment. But that's not my conclusion. Nor do I think the government has demonstrated a reduced commitment to achieving the goals of the 09 White Paper in this budget. Instead, I see what's happened as symptoms of serious and long-standing problems with Defence's financial management and capability planning. My aim today is to explain what these problems are and to propose solutions. But first, to fill out the context, I need to finish describing this year's budget. Next financial year, the Department of Defence will spend $26.5 billion of taxpayers' money, representing 1.8% of the nation's gross domestic product. That's an increase in real dollar terms of 4.2% on what they've spent this year. But there's a catch. Next year's increase only arises because $1.5 billion from the current year is going to be handed back, including $1.1 billion of investment funding and $400 million from recurrent funding. And it could have been worse. Without the last-minute opportunity buys of an extra C-17 Globemaster aircraft and the second-hand HMS Largs Bay from the United Kingdom, the handback of funds would have been closer to $2 billion. Here's the critical point. The cuts and deferrals to this year's budget are simply an acknowledgement that Defence cannot spend the money it asked for back in 2009. On the investment side, the deferrals reflect the poor delivery of projects by industry and the tardy approval of projects by government. On the recurrent spending side, the cuts largely reflect a systematic overestimate of the resources needed, though delays in the arrival of new capability have also been a factor. So where does this leave us? On the basis of this year's budget and new information that's become available over the last 12 months, we're now in a position to assess progress in implementing the government's 2009 Defence White Paper and its attendant Defence Capability Plan and Strategic Reform Program. Let's start with the DCP, Enforce 2030. Since 2000, the development of the Defence Force has been based around a long-term program of investment in new equipment, the Defence Capability Plan. The latest public version of the plan was released in December 2010 and covers the decade to 2019. It tells us about the acquisition projects that Defence plans over the next decade in pursuit of Force 2030. The Defence Force laid out in the 2009 White Paper. Given the inherently extended time needed to deliver defence projects, the current 10-year plan should contain around 75% of the additional equipment that will be in the Defence Force around 2030. Defence's incoming government brief from late last year said that, and I quote, "The implementation of Force 2030 is on track but under pressure." No such claim appears anywhere in this year's budget paraphernalia. Instead, Defence say the majority of adjustments to funding for Force 2030 projects in the budget involve projects commenced before the 2009 white paper, as if only projects commenced after 2009 somehow count. They can change the goalposts all they like. The fact is that the implementation of Force 2030 has fallen steadily behind schedule over the past 2 years. First pass approvals, the lead indicator of future activity, are most telling. Over the past 24 months, a mere 10 projects have been given the nod, whereas more than 3 times that number were planned. And it's set to get worse. Have a look at this slide here. It plots the number of planned and achieved first pass approvals from 2004-05 onwards, including figures taken from the latest version of the DCP, as amended by the projects that were conceded as having been delayed in the May budget. Apart from a small number of classified projects which are not listed in the DCP, this is a complete picture of current plans. And in case you're wondering, you won't find this information in a table in the back of the DCP. Defence stopped disclosing this sort of detail several years ago. It took me quite a while to extract, by statistical means, the underlying pattern of approvals that's going to be necessary to deliver the projects in the public DCP. 2 things were apparent as soon as you look at the plot. First, there's an enormous bow wave of approvals over the next 2 years. Around 58 first pass approvals are going to be required over the next 25 months to meet the current schedule, compared with 10 achieved over the past 24. Second, despite being a 10-year rolling program, which is based in turn on an undisclosed 20-year planning program, there is a long and sustained drought of approvals beginning in the middle of the decade. This raises serious questions about the sustainability and the completeness of the Defence Capability Plan. While the situation with second pass approvals is not quite as bad, it's hardly more encouraging once you look closely. Here's the second pass approvals, and as you can see, the peak of approvals is further to the right because first pass approvals have to be achieved before second pass can possibly occur. As you can see, there's been 7 projects approved this financial year. That's 7 non-classified projects. Only 4 of these were listed in the DCP, and 2 of these resulted from splitting a single phase of a project into 2 parts. Of the remainder, 2 were unplanned opportunity buys driven in part by this year's investment underspend. That's the C-17 Globemaster and the Largs Bay acquisitions. And the final is the additional purchase of Bushmasters, effectively a change of scope of an existing project. The net result is that only 3 projects have been removed from the DCP over the past 12 months through second pass. In any case, because a great many future second pass approvals are contingent on the mounting backlog of first pass approvals, caution is needed in extrapolating even this modest rate of second pass approvals into the future. Unless first pass approvals can be achieved, second pass approvals are simply not on the table. Given what was planned, and even taking account of the disruption due to the election last year, which, it should be mentioned, should not have come as a surprise, the rate of approvals over the past 24 months has been disappointing. But it's not surprising. What I've plotted here is the number of approvals, and that's what we now call second pass approvals, going all the way back to 1984-85. Red's what's been achieved, and blue's what's been approved in the future, what's planned for the future. Looking at it, what's planned for the future doesn't look unrealistic until you realise that there's actually a break in the data. The introduction of the 2-pass process saw a substantial drop in the rate of approvals of projects. 2 other points worth noting is when you have a white paper, you normally have a surge in approvals. You can see that in 94, you can see that in 2000. No such surge occurred in 2009. Second thing you can see is when there's election, or at least since the 1990s when there's an election, there's a suppression in the number of approvals. Consistent with that, we had an election last year which is being cited as one of the reasons for the slippage in project approvals. Since the adoption of the two-pass process, it's been recognised that it's going to take longer to get things through. As a result, Defence's response is to expand, diversify and upskill its capability development workforce. That program is now underway. It's to be commended. But such programs take a long time and they cannot deliver a rapid turnaround. In any case, to complicate matters further, looking at the planned approvals out there on the right, there's a white paper planned for 2014, which will see a hiatus in approvals beforehand, and an election the year before, which once again will be disruptive. Defence's already ambitious plans are about to be hit by a perfect storm. If the reality gap between planned and past approvals was all we had to worry about, things would be bad enough. But it's set to get worse. Because of the deferral of defence funding back in 2009 to accommodate the fiscal impact of the global financial crisis, baseline defence spending, exclusive of operational supplementation, will decline towards 2012-2013, the year when the government plans to return to surplus. After that, it rises quickly to regain the promised 3% real growth over the decade. Once again, you won't find this chart in any of Defence's published papers. I had to reverse engineer a diagram of GDP as a percentage of defence spending as a share of GDP in last year's intergenerational report to get the long-term defence funding requirements. You can see from the graph there the gouge that's taken out of the defence budget by the deferrals that occurred back in 2009. And just to relate these back to the charts I showed you a few moments ago, the precipitous rise in approvals that's planned over the next few years, in part is a result of a bow wave of delayed approvals being pushed forward, but predominantly it was built into the program back in 2009. So what we're seeing now is not so much the results of what's occurred over the last 2 years, but the results of decisions that were taken 2 years ago. The trouble with this deferral of funds is that the contraction and subsequent growth is concentrated in the major capital investment program. Slide 6. This is my best estimate of what the capital investment program looks like. Blue is the approved program, red is the unapproved program. I put the increase between the year the government goes back to surplus, 2012-2013, and the peak 4 years later as about 107% increase. Once again, this isn't exact. Defence doesn't release this information. I had to reverse engineer this from a chart that was used in a presentation by a Defence official in February this year. So it's not precise, but nonetheless I think it accurately reflects the extraordinary growth in investment that's planned. And it's this extraordinary growth in investment that is driving the requirement for an extraordinary mountain of approvals over the next couple of years. This seems to be very optimistic in the extreme, especially given the delays experienced this year due to the non-delivery of approved projects by industry. Unless the plan is to buy a massive quantity of new equipment off the shelf from overseas, this rapid expansion will sorely test the capacity of industry at exactly the same time as they're competing with the mining and resource sector for skilled labour in what's shaping up to be the largest resource boom in Australia's history. Thus, as things stand, Defence's acquisition plans over the next several years are simply unrealistic, and the deferrals in this year's budget only made things worse by amplifying the bow wave of approvals and spending ahead. As I said before, what was probably already an untenable plan in 2009 has been made even more so by recent decisions. There's no point clinging to existing plans. The development of the Defence Force needs to be put on a realistic and sustainable footing. Existing resources need to be directed towards approving a manageable program of new projects over the next several years, a program that can feasibly be delivered by industry. This will mean focusing efforts on those capabilities most urgently needed by the Defence Force and deferring others into the future. Doing so will demand more than tweaking the existing program at the margins. A comprehensive audit of Defence's present capability plan is required to get Force 2030 back on track. At the same time, the government needs to close the gap between the capacity of Defence to prepare projects for approval and the demands of the two-pass process. Efforts already underway to boost the capacity of the Capability Development Group should be given a high priority. At the same time, however, the government needs to ensure that the increasingly labyrinthine two-pass process is not wasting time in a futile effort to avoid the intrinsic risk that accompanies many defence acquisitions. Defence risk should be managed, not avoided. Let me move on now to look at the defence funding model and the strategic reform program. A centrepiece of the 2009 White Paper was a 21-year funding commitment built around 3% real growth in the defence budget to 2018-2019, accompanied by $20.6 billion worth of savings from the strategic reform program over the first decade. Although it's claimed the strategic reform program savings are being directed to fund Force 2030, nothing of the sort is occurring in practice. The budget is what the budget is. Instead, the savings are notional quantities relative to a counterfactual business as usual baseline of what it would have cost to deliver capability absent the reforms. Whatever money has been freed up for investment has already been factored into the investment budget. While this does not mean the savings are somehow less real, it does make them contingent on the credibility of the what would have been baseline. For two budgets now, I've examined the SRP savings program and compared it with what limited concrete data can be found in the public domain. My conclusion is twofold. Point one, the SRP is leading to substantial and worthwhile changes to the way Defence does business. Moreover, there are real and significant savings being delivered. These are most apparent in the area of capability sustainment, where Defence and industry have been working together to find innovative ways to maintain equipment more cheaply than has been the case in the past. The recent renegotiation of the Jindalee Operational Radar Network, JORN, maintenance contract is a good example. Savings of $100 million over the decade have been achieved, representing a 16% improvement on existing arrangements. And progress is not limited to material sustainment. For example, good progress is being made in rationalising and modernising Defence's information and communications infrastructure. There is no doubt that this will lead to reduced costs and better service in the future. Point two. Notwithstanding the efficiency gains that have been made, the overall scale of savings claimed is simply not credible. Let me explain. To start with, many of the claimed savings, around $5 billion worth, come from shifting expenditure from one category to another without any reform. My favourite example was picked up by the Audit Office recently. Over the first 4 years of the SRP, $150 million in previously planned facilities investment has been cancelled and designated as a saving. Yet at the same time, the SRP touts a $190 million capital facilities reinvestment program to help redress the deterioration in Defence facilities over the same period. With savings like this, the scale of possible savings is limited only by the size of the Defence budget. More importantly, many of the savings appear to be relative to implausibly high baselines. For example, last year Defence reported savings of $434 million in non-equipment procurement. To achieve this, they spent about $55 million on reform initiatives, yielding a net saving of $288 million. But going through the line items in the Defence annual reports for the areas ascribed to non-equipment procurement, we find that around $73 million more was spent in 09-10 than in the previous year. To summarise, they spent an extra $73 million, yet claimed a net saving of $288 million, meaning that the savings are calculated against a baseline of $361 million higher than spending in the previous year. Now, Defence would argue that their baseline for savings is robust and verified, and no doubt they would point to the fact that the Defence Force is expanding and costs are increasing. So it must be conceded that year on year the baseline would increase. But that proposition is steadily becoming harder to sustain as Defence continues to surrender savings and absorb additional costs year after year. Consider what happened in this year's budget. With so much extra money left over after savings have been delivered, it follows that the savings were calculated relative to an unrealistically high baseline. Indeed, on the basis of what we've learnt in this year's budget, it appears as though the baseline was about $4.3 billion too high. The 3.9 that was removed from government plus the 400 million that was handed back. But this might be an underestimate. Consider slide 8. Over the past 24 months, Defence has absorbed additional costs, surrendered new savings, accumulated unspent funds, and handed back more than $7.5 billion. At this rate, the Defence budget really is becoming the proverbial magic pudding. As a specific demonstration, consider civilian personnel. Around 300 million of the new savings come from reducing planned civilian numbers by 1,000 progressively over the next 3 years. But all signs are that Defence never needed the 1,000 positions in question. Last financial year they got by with 645 fewer people than planned, and this financial year they got by with 1,205 fewer than they said they needed. The 1,000 positions that were cut were never filled. Yet, the average strength of the civilian workforce next year is still planned to grow year on year by 992 positions. So while some of the 3.9 billion in additional savings and the 400 million returned this year probably reflect delays in introducing new capability into service, it's increasingly clear that Defence simply got more money than they needed from the 2009 Defence White Paper. And let's be realistic. If Defence can't predict what it needed for this year's budget, how can multi-billion-dollar savings ahead, years ahead, based on an understanding of business as usual costs a decade hence, be taken seriously? The time has come to stop pretending that Defence is a bottomless rabbit hole of savings and efficiencies. It undermines the credibility of the very good work that's being done under the Strategic Reform Program to deliver better value for money to the taxpayer. More importantly, it obscures the fact that Defence's financial management is in need of urgent attention. There are no quick solutions to this problem. It will take several years to develop the management information systems that Defence needs, and even then the effort will fail without a sensible business model that aligns accountability and control of resources. Hopefully, the soon-to-be-released response from the government to last year's review of accountability by Rufus Black will get things rolling. But that can only be the first step. Improved financial management has been promised repeatedly over the past 12 years and yet has remained elusive. The budget has been remediated, it's been rebaselined, it's been zero-based and it's been audited. Yet Defence spending remains more an emergent than managed phenomenon. The government needs to put a plan in place to fix Defence's budgeting and financial management. And given the importance, the plan should be made public so that we can track the milestones. Until financial planning and control is put on a solid basis, the defence budget will have to be managed from year to year as more is learnt about what it will cost to operate the raft of new capabilities entering service. It is entirely possible that the situation could revert from feast to famine in a relatively short time. Such are the uncertainties in our understanding of defence's costs. Let me conclude. This year's budget showed that there are serious problems with defence's capability planning and financial management. Firm action is urgently needed on both fronts. A capability audit is needed to put the defence capability plan back on a sustainable basis. The gap between the demands of the two-pass process and the capacity to prepare projects for approval needs to be closed. A comprehensive plan to fix defence's budgeting and financial management is needed, and in the meantime, defence funding will have to be adjusted year by year in a pragmatic way as a better understanding of costs emerges. Whatever happens, no progress will be possible by clinging to unfeasible plans and funding models that clearly exceed defence's capacity to spend. This means an end to the iconic promise of 3% real growth in defence spending that has hung like a lodestone around the necks of successive government. Fixing defence spending to an arbitrary growth figure is as poor a policy as it is lazy. Defence should only be given as much money as it can realistically and sensibly spend. Thank you.